Fox News Podcast presents Brett Baer's All-Star Panel.
America's got to be in the lead if you want to deal with these threats. We're going to lead.
The mourning is over. The Shiva is done. And if you're a conservative, you should be optimistic.
You know, my main priority right now is making sure that it delivers for the American people.
We have to make our country great again, and I will do that.
I think the president gets criticized by people all the time for the stuff he says, by people who ignore what he does.
Now, Fox's chief political anchor, Brett Baer.
White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt held her first White House briefing, where she took fiery questions at times from the media regarding the move to pause all federal grants and loans, including those for foreign aid, NGOs, and initiatives like diversity programs and clean energy, President Trump's deportations, and more.
Because there is a lot of reporting out there that is putting the onus on this White House for the increased cost of eggs. I would like to point out to each and every one of you that in 2024, when Joe Biden was in the Oval Office, or upstairs in the residence sleeping, I'm not so sure, egg prices increased 65% in this country. We also have seen the cost of everything, not just eggs. Bacon, groceries, gasoline have increased because of the inflationary policies of the last administration.
Meanwhile, the Senate considers three of President Trump's most controversial nominees: RFK Jr. for HHS Secretary, Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence, and Kash Patel for FBI Director. The Senate confirmed Scott Bessent as Treasury Secretary and Transportation Secretary nominee Sean Duffy in a bipartisan vote. For a conversation on this and more, we bring in our panel: Fox News Radio political analyst Josh Kraushaar, Chief Political Correspondent for the Washington Examiner Byron York, and Democratic pollster Carly Cooperman. Byron, this pause is being described by the White House as a short pause to review all of the money going out the door. Not specifically a blanket over every expenditure, and they have a list of things that are not included, but it is creating chaos and a lot of pushback on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, they are making clear that people who receive individual payments, like Social Security recipients, people who receive individual payments from the federal government are not going to lose those. They're not going to change. But I have to say, this particular action is really the first thing we've seen, I think, from the Trump administration too, that feels a little bit like something that could have been done in the first days of Trump administration 1. Maybe not fully thought through, and certainly not explained enough. I think there's plenty of rationale for what they're doing, but perhaps not explaining it very well to begin with, and leaving a lot of questions in people's minds, so that it does, give the press a whole lot to try to dig into.
Yeah, and Carly, obviously the pushback is that you're talking about grants here runs the gamut. I mean, NIH, universities, all kinds of things that maybe had planned for funding to continue, and this is a pause. It's not to say that the funding's not continuing. It is going to be analyzed by the OMB, but it is a pause in operations.
That's right. And when you have grants that are impacting providing meals for seniors, school for low-income children, the Medicaid website being frozen, these are the kind of things where the impact of acting swiftly and hastily is seen not necessarily in a positive light. I think Trump so far has effectively used his shock and awe approach with the rapid and massive pace that he's releasing these executive orders. The press doesn't have time to digest and dig in. Democrats up until now have been relatively quiet, kind of figuring out, what's going to be the response? How can we use our response most effectively? Understanding that Trump promised this shock and awe and believe that is what people want. However, there's one thing when you're talking about reversing DEI orders. It's another thing when you take this drastic measure where it creates chaos in a way that's going to impact programs that certainly go beyond what is intended to do with these executive orders.
Yeah, Josh, and you wonder whether there will be an adjustment here, whether the OMB will step in. By the way, the head is still, in limbo here on the Senate side, and that could delay that further.
It could, though. Interestingly enough, Brett, the OMB office did put out clarification about the executive order, saying it's really focused on the previous executive orders on more popular cuts to DEI and to other what they call wasteful programs. Look, the Democratic argument during the campaign was that Trump wanted to cut spending really close to the bone, and it would actually really impact a lot of everyday Americans on issues from everything dealing with housing aid or medical research or dealing with natural disasters. And I agree with Byron and Carly that I think there was a little bit of an own goal here, and that they weren't very clear about what programs would be paused and what ones could down the road be eventually cut. And a lot of the federal money actually goes through the states and then ends up going to individuals. And at the briefing today, it wasn't very clear whether that indirect spending to individuals for Medicaid, for Head Start programs, and other popular programs would be affected. And there's a lot of chaos right now as a lot of stakeholders figure this all out.
But Byron, there was also reporting in the Pentagon that when the DEI programs were stopped, that, for example, training that included talking about Tuskegee Airmen in the Air Force was going to be wiped out. And that was not true. It did not happen. And they made sure that they talked about that. However, my point being is that there may be a reality here, what the administration is trying to do, and yet the chaos and back and forth and wondering whether it affects my grant or this or that just creates this vacuum.
Yeah, I think you raise an excellent point there. One thing to what Josh said, I don't think this is really about saving money. I think it's about getting rid of programs that the Trump administration ideologically opposes. I think it's getting rid of an executive branch that's doing a lot of democratic sort of things that the Trump administration doesn't want to do. And as far as the DEI and the Tuskegee Airmen, there was an interesting phrase, and I think Katie Britt, the senator from Alabama, used it, that the military was engaging in malicious compliance. That is, they were opposed to what the new incoming administration was doing as far as DEI was concerned. They said, okay, well, we'll just get rid of this, and there'll be an outrage, and you can't talk about the Tuskegee Airmen, and that's a terrible situation. So I think there could be a little bit of that malicious compliance involved in that particular instance.
Yeah, and there is two sides of this. One is, of course, there's chaos and confusion. It could be explained better. But there's also, Carly, a long list of grants that go for things that no one has really looked at in a long time. And they've been, overseen by NIH and just have, over years continued. And in reality, maybe they're not the best use of money. And a pause to analyze from the administration's point of view, is that justified, or is it that Congress provided that money and they expect it to be going out the door?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point, Brett. I mean, one of the things that Trump effectively communicated on the campaign was this idea of excessive spending, a bloated government. I think people liked the idea of cutting wasteful spending and also connecting that to people who are struggling to live in their day-to-day lives and high cost of living. And let's use our money more effectively. Let's get rid of the waste and all of that. And so if the argument is, hey, there are these grants and existing programs that have been out for so long and they're not effective, then I think there's receptivity to that among the American people. However, there has to be an approach and a process and a procedure that is done so that the things that are important to people and are helping people, especially low-income people who Trump was really able to galvanize this cycle, there has to be an approach that protects those kinds of programs. And taking a slower, methodical approach is completely in contrast to how Trump has so far approached his presidency and how he wants to do it. He wants to show, look at me coming out with things that are responding to the people and to the promises that I made. But eventually you're going to run into some sort of conflict. And I think that's what we're seeing right now.
We're not just seeing it there, Josh. You have Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley adding on to Illinois Senator Dick Durbin writing a letter to President Trump saying that they're concerned about the firing of inspectors general from 18 offices, saying that Congress was not provided legally required 30-day notice or specific reasons for removal as required by law. So essentially signing on to this letter saying he's breaking the law by firing these IGs, and says he wants an answer. This is Chuck Grassley.
Yeah, like it wasn't a very oppositional comment, but it was an acknowledgement that the legislative branch thinks that there may have been some excess here, that the White House didn't abide by the 30-day notice if they were going to dismiss these inspectors general. And the fact that this was such a, it wasn't just one agency, it was almost across the board, raises questions about the degree of checks and balances, and not just how the role of the inspectors general will play at these agencies during the Trump administration, but the role of the legislative branch as a check, and how aggressive Grassley will be in asking questions and demanding answers. So yeah, I mean it was one of those decisions, moves by the Trump administration that really raised eyebrows, and it's the type of thing that generated reams of headlines and a lot of outrage in the first term when things like this happened. A little bit more muted perhaps this time around.
Byron, what'd you make of Karoline Leavitt's first run at the press briefing?
Well, I thought it was a very competent performance, very smooth, and she had to answer a number of questions that on this issue we were just talking about. I do think there was one, and this is inside baseball, but kind of unintentionally funny moment, in the sense that at the beginning she comes out and they make a big deal about how they're going to include new media going forward, voices in the media that previously had not been heard before, and so that's a great idea. It's a good idea. They've got some new ways to do it. The first question for a new media figure goes to a reporter who just exemplifies being the veteran Washington reporter who was covering the White House for the Washington Post 25 years ago. So I think that there was one unintentionally funny moment at the beginning, but otherwise a very smooth performance.
All right, we're going to take a quick pause here. We'll be back after this. It was different, Carly. There wasn't a big binder up there. She's clearly knows her brief, but it is a different environment, too, with the press and how the questions are flowing.
Yeah, I actually thought it was interesting, her answer to the conversation about eggs and the price of eggs, because she was armed with a whole line of attack. I think some had some truth to it and some was stretching the truth to, obviously be the advocate for Trump that she's supposed to be, but, quickly pivoting to blaming the Biden administration for the cost of eggs, and, had a whole slew of reasons why this was not the Trump administration's fault. I think the point is that one of Trump's key promises is that the cost of living is expensive and he's going to make it less expensive. And so, the fact that at this point she doesn't have an answer as to how they're actually going to do that, besides, confirming appointees and the like, kind of speaks to, what she's going to do. She's going to go out there and be argumentative, cast blame away from Trump, and we'll see how it goes.
It is a tough job, though, because really, Josh, he is his own press secretary. I mean, he's in front of the media almost every day. He's answered more questions every day than we saw with the previous administration, previous president in many months.
I was going to say, like, the real press secretary in this White House is Donald Trump. He has been more accessible in the first week of his administration than I think Joe Biden was in like the last year of his term. I mean, so the role of the press secretary is going to be a little bit different, not just because of Trump's style and what he wants out of a press secretary, but because he is so accessible and he really enjoys kind of sparring and discussing, the day's news with the media. I thought he did a pretty talented job of multitasking when he was signing executive orders and taking questions from the press at what was a really remarkable moment early on, the first days of his administration. So Trump is, and I think that was said during the briefing today, that even though we're going to have these regular briefings, Donald Trump will be very accessible for the time to come.
Yeah, when he was reacting to each executive order, saying, "Ooh, this is a big one." That was good. Going back to the first topic that we had, this is Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin just posted on X, saying this: I've spoken to senior officials at the White House and confirmed the temporary pause by OMB does not impact individual assistance and will not interrupt disaster recovery efforts, school and child care funding, health care for seniors or low-income families, funding for our roads, meals and lunches, or any other misinformation that has spread. The partisan stunt to disseminate knowingly misleading information is dangerous and fear-mongering and completely wrong. President Trump is doing what an executive should do at the beginning of a term, which is find out where the money is and where it's going, not unlike what we did at the beginning of our term here in Virginia when we identified $1.4 billion in appropriated but unspent taxpayer money. So that explanation, just on X in the past few minutes, Byron, was better than what came out of the White House at the beginning.
Absolutely. And the fact that Youngkin had to make that explanation tells you that the White House did not do a good enough job communicating this at the beginning. If people were wondering, will this affect disaster relief, then they haven't done a very good job explaining what's going on. So good for the governor, but you're right, the White House should have done it first.
Yeah. And Carly, that is public relations 101. You got to make sure people understand where you're coming from.
Right. I mean, you had Josh Stein in North Carolina say that he's concerned that the freezing of grants is going to hurt the Recovery Act from Hurricane Helene that happened in the fall. You know, Trump has already talked about how he's already politicized that before, where it's saying, you know, the effort to support the recovery, you know, it was Biden's fault. Now they're going to help. And so when you have people in disaster talking about how this is going to hurt them, you know, you're losing control of the narrative, and that is not a position you want to be in.
Yeah, and Josh, I mean, we're already seeing the maneuvers, not only on Capitol Hill. There's a group of attorneys general saying they'll seek an injunction blocking the Trump administration from freezing as much as $3 trillion in federal grants, loans, and aid. And that's all being formed with New York, California, Massachusetts, Illinois, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Colorado, Michigan, Arizona. They're all getting together this afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of action will be in the courts in the coming months in terms of seeing how much of these administration's executive orders get implemented. You know, people talk about who the Democrats' next leaders are going to be and where they're going to be coming from. It wouldn't be surprising to see one or two of these attorneys general in these blue states to emerge as something of an oppositional leader to the administration.
And finally, Byron, I mean, this is a very different administration. You just had the newly confirmed and sworn in Secretary of Department of Homeland Security go on a raid in New York, and then came and delivered the first official speech as DHS Secretary in Washington, and took the stage to Trace Adkins' song Hot Mama. So this is a different pitch. This is a different thing.
You know, I think you're right about that. And the good thing, as far as that particular part of the story is concerned, that's where the administration is enjoying substantial successes, getting stuff done. I mean, every day you're seeing ICE agents pull out people, and you think, what in the world were they doing in the country to begin with? I cannot believe that they were here. So good for the Trump administration for removing them. But you're right. This is the president himself is sort of the greatest showman in politics. And I think you're going to see a lot of showmanship throughout the administration as well.
Yeah. And it doesn't seem like they're worried about any pushback on any of that. And they're having fun, it seems. Panel, thanks. Now for a bit of history. On January 28, 1986, the U.S. Space Shuttle Challenger exploded shortly after liftoff, killing all 7 members aboard, including a schoolteacher who had been chosen to be the first American civilian to travel in space. President Reagan delivered one of his most memorable addresses from the Oval Office that night, consoling a grieving nation. While some of his staff worried the speech didn't strike the right tone, Reagan quipped the next day, well, Frank Sinatra called, and he said it landed. He doesn't call after every speech. That'll do it for this week. You can hear more of this series at foxnews.com, foxnewspodcast.com, or wherever you download podcasts. Make sure to leave a rating and review. We want to hear from you. For Byron, Carly, and Josh, I'm Brett Baer. We'll see you next time. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.